Part 9. With the Red Army. Continued. 1. Xu Haidong, the Red Potter. One morning I went to Peng De Huai's headquarters and found several members of his staff there just finishing up a conference. They invited me in and opened a watermelon. As we sat around tables spitting out seeds onto the kang, I noticed a young commander I had not seen before. Peng De Huai saw me looking at him, and he said banteringly, "That's a famous red bandit over there. Do you not recognize him?" The new arrival had promptly grinned, blushed crimson, and in a most disarming way exposed a big cavern where 2 front teeth should have been. It gave him a childish and impish appearance, and everybody smiled. "He is the man you have been eager to meet," supplied Peng. "He wants you to visit the army. His name is Xu Haidong." Of all the red military commanders of China, probably none was more notorious, and certainly none was more of a mystery than Xu Haidong. Scarcely anything was known of him to the outside world except that he had once worked in a Hubei pottery, and that Chiang Kai-shek had branded him a scourge of civilization. Recently Nanjing's aeroplanes had visited the Red Lines to drop leaflets containing, among other inducements to deserters, including $100 to every red soldier who brought his rifle with him to the Kuomintang, the following promise: "Kill Peng De Huai or Xu Haidong, and we will give you $100,000 when you join our army. Kill any other bandit leader, and we will reward you accordingly." And here, poised shyly over a pair of square, boyish shoulders, sat that head which Nanjing apparently valued no less than Peng De Huai's. I acknowledged the pleasure, wondering what it felt like to have a life worth that much to any one of your subordinates, and asked Xu whether he was really serious about the invitation to visit his army. He was commander of the 15th Red Army Corps, with headquarters then located about 80 li to the northwest, in Yuwang. "I already have a room arranged for you in the bell tower," he responded. "Just let me know when you want to come, then I'll send an escort for you." We made it a bargain on the spot. And so, a few days later, carrying a borrowed automatic, a confiscation of my own from a red officer, I set out for Yuwang, accompanied by 10 red troopers armed with rifles and Mausers, for in places our roads skirted red positions only a short distance behind the front lines. In contrast with the eternal hills and valleys of Shanxi and Gansu, the road we followed, a road that led to the Great Wall and the lonely beautiful grasslands of Inner Mongolia, crossed high tablelands, striped with long green meadows and dotted with tall bunch grass and softly rounded hills, on which great herds of sheep and goats grazed. Eagles and buzzards sometimes flew overhead. Once a herd of wild gazelles came near us, sniffed the air, and then swooped off with incredible speed and grace around a protecting mountainside. In 5 hours we reached the centre of Yuwang, an ancient Mohammedan city of 400 or 500 families, with a magnificent wall of stone and brick. Outside the city was a Mohammedan temple, with its own walls of beautiful glazed brick unscarred. But other buildings showed signs of the siege this city had undergone before it was taken by the Reds. A 2-story building that had been the magistrate's headquarters was partly ruined, and its facade was pitted with bullet holes. I was told that this and other buildings on the outskirts had been destroyed by the defending troops of General Ma Honghui when the Red Siege had first begun. The enemy had withdrawn from all extramural buildings after setting fire to them to prevent the Reds occupying them as positions of attack against the city walls. When the city fell, Xu Haidong told me, there was only a very minor battle. We surrounded and blockaded Yuwang for 10 days. Inside there was 1 brigade of Ma Honghui's cavalry and about 1,000 Mintuan. We made no attack at all until the 10th night. It was very dark. We put a ladder on the wall. A company scaled it before the enemy guards discovered it, and then they defended the ladder with a machine gun while a regiment of our troops mounted the wall. There was little fighting. Before dawn we had disarmed all of the Mintuan and surrounded the brigade of cavalry. Only 1 of our men was killed, and only 7 were wounded. We gave the Mintuan $1 apiece and sent them back to their farms, and we gave Ma's men $2 each. Several hundred of them stayed and enlisted with us. The magistrate and the brigade commander escaped over the east wall while their troops were being disarmed. I spent 5 days with the 15th Army Corps and found every waking hour intensely interesting, and of it all nothing was better material for an investigator of the Soviet regions, as I was labelled in Yuwang, than the story of Xu Haidong himself. I talked with him every night when his duties were finished. I rode with him to the front lines of the 73rd Division, and I went to the Red Theatre with him. He told me for the first time the history of the Henan Anhui Hubei Soviet Republic, which had never been fully known. As organizer of the first partisan army of that great red area, which was second in size only to the Central Soviets of Jiangxi, Xu Haidong knew every detail of its development. Xu struck me as the most strongly class-conscious man, in manner, appearance, conversation, and background, of all the red leaders I met. While the majority of the subordinate officers were from the poor peasantry, many of the high commanders were from middle-class or middle peasant families, or from the intelligentsia. Xu was a very obvious exception. He was proud of his proletarian origin, and he often referred to himself with a grin as a coolie. One could tell he sincerely believed that the poor of China, the peasants and the workers, were good people, kind, brave, unselfish, honest, while the rich had a monopoly on all of the vices. It was as simple as that for him, I thought. He was fighting to get rid of the vices. The absolutism of faith kept his cocky comments about his own daredevilry and his army's superiority from sounding like vanity and conceit. When he said, 1 red is worth 5 whites, it was to him a statement of irrefutable fact. He was immensely proud of his army, the men as individuals, their skill as soldiers, as horsemen, and as revolutionaries. He was proud of their Lenin clubs and their artistically made posters, which were really very good. And he was proud of his division commanders, 2 of whom were, quote, coolies like myself, and one of whom, a red for 6 years, was only 21 years old. Xu valued very highly any act of physical prowess, and it was his regret that 8 wounds he had collected in 10 years of fighting now slightly handicapped him. He did not smoke or drink, and he still had a slender, straight-limbed body, every inch of which seemed to be hard muscle. He had been wounded in each leg, in each arm, in the chest, a shoulder, and a hip. 1 bullet had entered his head just below the eye, and emerged behind his ear, and yet he still gave the impression of a peasant youth who had but recently stepped out of the rice fields, rolled down his trouser leg, and joined a passing free company of warriors. I found out also about the missing teeth. They had been lost during a riding accident. Galloping along the road one day, his horse's hoof struck a soldier, and Xu turned in the saddle to see whether he had been hurt. The horse shied and knocked Xu into a tree. When he regained consciousness 2 weeks later, it was to discover that his upper incisors had been left with the tree. "Aren't you afraid you'll be hurt someday?" I asked him. "Not much," he laughed. "I've been taking beatings since I was a child, and I'm used to it by now." Like most other combat Reds, he spoke mainly about battles, but his few references to his childhood seemed to me significant. Xu Haidong was born in 1900 in Huangpi Xian, Yellow Slope County, near Hankou. His family had for generations been potters, and in his grandfather's day had owned land, but since then, through drought, flood, and taxation, had been proletarianized. His father and 5 brothers had worked in a kiln in Huangpi and made enough to live. They were all illiterate, but ambitious for Haidong, a bright child and the youngest son, and they scraped together the money necessary to send him to school. My fellow students, Xu told me, were nearly all the sons of landlords or merchants, as few poor boys ever got to school. I studied at the same desks with them, but many hated me because I seldom had any shoes, or my clothes were poor and ragged. I could not avoid fighting with them when they cursed me. If I ran to the teacher for help, I was invariably beaten by him, but if the landlord's sons got the worst of it and went to the teacher, I was also beaten. In my 4th year in school when I was 11, I got involved in a rich against poor quarrel, and was driven to a corner by a crowd of rich sons. We were throwing sticks and stones. The one I threw cut the head of a child named Huang, son of a wealthy landlord, and this boy went off crying, and in a short time returned with his family. The elder Huang said that I had forgotten my birth, and he kicked and beat me. The teacher then gave me a second beating. After that I ran away from school and refused to return. The incident made a deep impression on me. I believed from then on that it was impossible for a poor boy to get justice. Xu became an apprentice in pottery, where he received no wages during his thanking the master years. At 16 he was a full journeyman, and the highest paid potter among 300 workers. "I can turn out a good piece of pottery as fast as anyone in China," Xu smilingly boasted. "So when the revolution is over, I'll still be a useful citizen." He recalled an incident that did not increase his love for the gentry. A travelling theatrical troupe came to our neighbourhood, and the workers went to see it. Wives of the gentry and officials were also there. Naturally, the workers were curious to see what these closely guarded wives of the great ones looked like, and they kept staring into the boxes. At this, the gentry ordered the Mintuan to drive them out of the theatre, and there was a fight. Later on, our factory master had to give a banquet for the offended nobility and shoot off some firecrackers to compensate for the spoiled purity of those women who had been gazed upon by the people. The master tried to take the money for this banquet from our wages, but we threatened to strike, and he changed his mind. This was my first experience of the power of organization as a weapon of defense for the poor. When he was 21, angered by a domestic quarrel, Xu left home. He walked to Hankou, then made his way to Jiangxi, where he worked for a year as a potter, and saved his money, and planned to return to Huangpi. but he caught cholera and exhausted his savings while recovering. Ashamed to return empty-handed, he joined the army, where he was promised $10 a month. He received only beatings. Meanwhile, the nationalist revolution was beginning in the south, and communists were propagandizing in Xu's army. Several of them were beheaded. Disgusted with the warlord army, he deserted with one of the officers, fled to Guangzhou, and joined the 4th Kuomintang army under Zhang Fagui. There he remained until 1927. He had become a platoon commander. In the spring of 1927, the nationalist forces were breaking into left-wing and right-wing groups, and this conflict was especially sharp in Zhang Fagui's army, which had reached the Yangtze River. Siding with the radicals, Xu was forced to flee, and secretly he returned to Yellow Slope. By now he had become a communist, having been much influenced by some student propagandists, and in Huangpi he at once began building up a local branch of the party. The right coup d'état occurred in April 1927, and communism was driven underground. But not Xu Haidong. He organized most of the workers in the potteries and some local peasants. From these he now recruited the first workers' and peasants' army of Hubei. They numbered in the beginning only 17 men, and they had 1 revolver and 8 bullets, Xu's own. This was the nucleus of what later became the 4th Front Red Army of 60,000 men, which in 1932 had under its control a Sovietized territory the size of Ireland. It had its own post office, credit system, mints, cooperatives, textile factories, and in general a fairly well-organized rural economy. Xu Xiangjian, a Huangpu graduate and former Kuomintang officer, became commander-in-chief of the 4th Army. His political leader was Zhang Guotao, the founder of the Communist Party who was later to challenge Mao for control of the Central Committee. Together they set up a Chinese type of Soviet government in the border areas of 3 provinces, Hubei, Anhui, and Henan. The ancient names of these provinces were O, Yu, and Wan. Combining them, the Reds named their interprovincial regime the Oyvwan Soviet, and affiliated it with the All-China Soviet government headed by Mao Zedong south of the Yangtze. Oyvwan withstood several surroundings and expanded its territory until October of 1932. By then the nationalists had succeeded in penetrating far into the richest base area. To avoid encirclement, Zhang Guotao and Xu Xiangjian withdrew their main forces westward. Xu Haidong was ordered to remain behind with his 25th Army, to regroup scattered partisan units and make a new stand, while the main nationalist forces pursued the Xu Xiangjian command. Unexpectedly, Xu Haidong's guerrillas won important victories, and once more the nationalists were forced out of Oyvwan. In 1933 they returned the offensive, and in 1934, coincident with the 5th Annihilation Campaign in the south, the Generalissimo strangled the little republic to death. At the end of 1934, Xu Haidong led a band of no more than 2,000 men in a breakthrough to the west, finally uniting with Mao Zedong's forces in northern Shanxi in 1935. Besides the economic blockade, daily air bombing, and the construction of a network of thousands of small forts around the Oyvwan area, the Nanjing generals evidently pursued a policy of systemic removal or annihilation of the civilian population. During the 5th campaign, the anti-Red forces in Hubei and Anhui, then numbering about 300,000, were stiffened with officers whom Chiang Kai-shek had spent a year indoctrinating with anti-Red propaganda at his Nanchang and Nanjing military academies. The result was civil war, with the intensity of religious wars. 2. Class war in China. For 3 days, several hours every afternoon and evening, I had been asking Xu Haidong and his staff questions about their personal histories, about their troops, about the fate of the Oyvwan Soviet Republic, and about their present situation in the northwest. Then, in answer to my question, "Where is your family now?" Xu Haidong replied matter-of-factly, "All of my clan have been killed except one brother who is with the 4th Front Army." "You mean killed in fighting?" "Oh, no, only 3 of my brothers were Reds. The rest of the clan were executed by Generals Tang Empo and Xia Douyin. Altogether, the Kuomintang officers killed 66 members of the Xu clan." 66? "Yes, 27 of my near relatives were executed, and 39 distant relatives. Everyone in Huangpi Xian named Xu. Old and young men, women, children, even babies were killed. The Xu clan was wiped out, except for my wife and 3 brothers in the Red Army, and myself. 2 of my brothers were killed in battle later on." "And your wife?" "I don't know what happened to her. She was captured when the white troops occupied Huangpi in 1931. Afterwards I heard that she had been sold as a concubine to a merchant near Hankou. My brothers who escaped told me about that, and about the other killings. During the 5th campaign, 13 of the Xu clan escaped from Huangpi and fled to Lixiangxian, but were all arrested there. The men were beheaded, the women and children were shot. Xu noticed the shocked look on my face and grinned mirthlessly. That was nothing unusual, he said. That happened to the clans of many Red officers, though mine had the biggest losses. Chiang Kai-shek had given an order that when my district was captured, no one named Xu should be left alive. I wrote many pages of notes of conversations with Xu and his comrades, notes of dates, places, and detailed accounts of outrages allegedly inflicted on civilians by nationalist troops in Oyvwan. It would be pointless to repeat the details of the more horrendous crimes reported. Like the tragic events in Spain of the same period, it would seem incredible to skeptics who read of them from afar. For the person who has not actually witnessed atrocities, all remains hearsay and suspect. To accept the degradation of any man by man injures our self-esteem. And even if the stories were true, were not the Reds themselves engaged in violence, differing only in the choice of class victims? The Kuomintang press, however, had for years been telling only their side of the class war story. To help fill in the picture for history, it should not be unedifying to know what the leaders of this fundamentally peasant revolution, as Mao Zedong insisted it was, said of their fellow man, and saw themselves as fighting against. During the 5th anti-Red campaign, as already noted, nationalist officers gave orders in many areas to exterminate the civilian population. This was held to be militarily necessary because, as the Generalissimo remarked in one of his speeches, where the Soviets had been long established, it was impossible to tell a Red bandit from a good citizen. The method appears to have been applied with singular savagery in the Oyvwan Republic, chiefly because some of the leading Kuomintang generals in charge of the anti-Red operations were natives of that region, sons of landlords who had lost their land to the Reds, and hence had an insatiable desire for revenge. The population in the Soviets had decreased by about 600,000 at the end of the 5th campaign. Red tactics in Oyvwan had depended upon mobility over a wide territory, and at the beginning of every annihilation drive, their main forces had moved out of the Red districts to engage the enemy on its own ground. They had no important strategic bases to defend, and readily moved from place to place to decoy, divert, distract, and otherwise gain maneuvering advantages. This left the periphery of their human base very much exposed. But in the past, Kuomintang troops had not killed the farmers and townsmen who they found peacefully pursuing their tasks in Soviet areas they occupied. In the 5th campaign, as in Jiangxi, new tactics were adopted. Instead of engaging the Red Army in the open field, the Nanjing troops advanced in heavy, concentrated units behind extensive fortifications, bit by bit penetrating into Red territory, systematically either annihilating or transporting the entire population in wide areas inside and outside the Red borders. They sought to make of such districts a desolate, uninhabited wasteland, incapable of supporting the Red troops if they should later recapture it. Thousands of children were taken prisoner and driven to Hankou and other cities where they were sold into apprenticeships. Thousands of young girls and women were transported and sold into the factories as slave girls and prostitutes. In the cities they were palmed off as famine refugees or orphans of people killed by the Reds. I remembered that hundreds of them reportedly reached the big industrial centres in 1934. A considerable trade grew up with middlemen buying the boys and women from Kuomintang officers. It became a very profitable business for a while, but threatened to corrupt the ranks of the army. Missionaries began talking about it, and Chiang Kai-shek was obliged to issue a stern order forbidding this bribe-taking and ordering strict punishment for officers engaged in the traffic. By December 1933, said Xu Haidong, about half of Oyvwan had become a vast wasteland. Over a once rich country, there were very few houses left standing. Cattle had all been driven away, the fields were unkept, and there were piles of bodies in nearly every village that had been occupied by the white troops. 4 counties in Hubei, 5 in Anhui, and 3 in Henan were almost completely ruined. In an area some 400 li from east to west and about 300 li from north to south, the whole population was being killed or removed. During the year's fighting, we recaptured some of these districts from the white troops, but when we returned, we found fertile lands had become semi-deserts. Only a few old men and women remained, and they would tell tales that horrified us. We could not believe such crimes had been committed by Chinese against Chinese. In November 1933, we retreated from Tiantaishan and Laozhunshan, Soviet districts where there were then around 60,000 people. When we returned 2 months later, we found that these peasants had been driven from their land, their houses had been burned or destroyed by bombing, and there were not more than 300 old men and a few sickly children in that whole region. From them we learned what had happened. As soon as the white troops arrived, the officers had begun dividing the women and girls. Those with bobbed hair or natural feet had been shot as communists. Higher officers looked over the others and picked out pretty ones for their own, and then the lower officers had been given their choice. The rest had been turned over to the soldiers to use as prostitutes. They had been told that these women were bandit wives and therefore they could do what they liked with them. Many of the young men in those districts had joined the Red Army, but many of those who remained behind, and even some of the old men, tried to kill the white officers for these crimes. Those who protested were all shot as communists. The survivors told us that many fights had occurred among the whites who had quarrelled among themselves about the distribution of women. After they had been despoiled, these women and girls were sent to the towns and cities where they were sold, only the officers keeping a few pretty ones for concubines. "Do you mean to say these were the troops of the national government?" I asked. Yes, they were the 13th Army Corps of General Tang Empo and the 3rd Army Corps of General Wang Jun. Generals Xia Douyin, Liang Guangyin, and Song Tiancai were also responsible. Xu told of another district, Huangganxian in Hubei, which the Reds recovered from General Wang Jun in July 1933. In the town of Cuyunzhai, where there was once a street of flourishing Soviet cooperatives and happy people, everything was in ruins and only a few old men were alive. They led us out to a valley and showed us the scattered bodies of 17 young women lying half naked in the sun. They had all been raped and killed. The white troops had evidently been in a great hurry. They had taken the time to pull off only one leg of a girl's trousers. That day we called a meeting. The army held a memorial service there, and we all wept. Not long afterwards, in Mahjong, we came to one of our former athletic fields. There, in a shallow grave, we found the bodies of 12 comrades who'd been killed. Their skin had been stripped from them, their eyes gouged out, and their ears and noses cut off. We all broke into tears of rage at this barbaric sight. In the same month also in Huanggan, our 25th Red Army reached Aogongzhai. This had once been a lively place, but it was now deserted. We walked outside the town and saw a peasant's hut with smoke coming from it on a hillside, and some of us climbed up to it, but the only occupant was an old man who had apparently gone insane. We walked down into the valley again until we came along a pile of dead men and women. There were more than 400 bodies lying there, and they had evidently been killed only a short time before. In some places the blood was several inches deep. Some women were lying with their children still clutched to them. Many bodies were lying one on top of another. Suddenly I noticed one of the bodies move, and going over to it found it was a man still alive. We found several more alive after that, altogether more than 10. We carried them back with us and treated their wounds, and they told us what had happened. These people had fled from the town to hide in this valley and had encamped in the open. Afterwards the white officers had led their troops to the spot, ordered them to put up their machine guns on the mountainside, and had opened fire on the people below. They had kept firing for several hours until they thought everybody was dead. Then they had marched away again, without even coming down to look at them. Xu said the next day he led his whole army out of that valley and showed them the dead, among whom some of the soldiers recognized peasants they'd known, men and women who must have given them shelter at one time, or sold them melons, or traded to the cooperatives. They were deeply moved. Xu said this experience steeled his troops with a stubborn morale and a determination to die fighting, and that throughout the entire 12 months of the last Great Annihilation Drive, not a single man had deserted from the 25th Army. Toward the end of the 5th campaign, he continued, nearly every house had dead in it. We used to enter a village that seemed empty until we looked into the ruined houses. Then we would find corpses in doorways, on the floor or on the kang, or hidden away somewhere. Even the dogs had fled from many villages. In those days we did not need spies to watch the enemy's movements. We could follow them quite easily by the skies filled with smoke from burning towns and hamlets. This was a very small part of what I heard from Xu Haidong and others who fought through the terrible year, and finally trekked westward, not their army but its human base destroyed, its hills and valleys stained with the blood of its youth, the living heart of it torn out. Later on I talked to many warriors from Oyvwan, and they told tales more pitiful still. They did not like to talk of what they had seen, they did so only under questioning, and it was clear their experiences had permanently marked the matrix of their minds with a class hatred ineradicable for life. Again, one asked whether that meant that the Reds were innocent of atrocity and class revenge themselves. I thought not. It was true that during my 4 months with them, as far as I could learn from unrestricted but limited inquiry, they had executed but 2 civilians. It was also true that I did not see a single village or town burned by them, or hear from the many farmers I questioned that the Reds were addicted to arson. But my personal experience started and ended with the few months spent with them in the northwest. What killing and burning might have been done elsewhere I could not affirm or deny. One of the 2 ill-fated counter-revolutionaries mentioned above was not killed by the Reds, but by some Ningxia Muslims with a strong distaste for tax collectors. Further on it will be told in what manner he met his demise, but first let us see how these Muslims have been ruled. 3. 4 great horses. One might say that Qinghai, Ningxia, and northern Gansu were the prototype of the fantasia of Swifts, the land of Humanims, for they were ruled as the satrapy of 4 great horses, whose fame was widespread in China. Over the areas mentioned, power was divided, before the Reds began edging the Hunahins out of considerable portions of their domain, by a family of Mohammedan generals named Ma, the Mrs. Ma Hongkui, Ma Hongbing, Ma Bufang, and Ma Puqing, and this particular Ma means horse. Ma Hongkui was governor of Ningxia, and his cousin Ma Hongbing, former governor of the same province, was now ruler of a shifting fiefdom in northern Gansu. They were distantly related to Ma Bufang, many-wived son of the famous Mohammedan leader Ma Kejin. Ma Bufang inherited his father's toga, and in 1937 became the Nanjing-appointed pacification commissioner of that province, while his brother, Ma Bujing, helped out in Qinghai and in addition ruled the greater Gansu panhandle, which in the west separated Qinghai from Ningxia. For a decade this distant country had been run like a medieval sultanate by the Ma family, with some assistance from an Allah of their own. 2 of the great horses claimed to be nobles, descendants of a Mohammedan aristocracy which sometimes played a decisive role in the history of China's northwest. The brothers Ma, like many Muslims in China, had Turkish blood in them. As early as the 6th century, a race which we now know as the Turks had become powerful enough on China's northwestern frontier to make important demands of the monarchs of the plains. In a couple of centuries they had built up an empire extending from eastern Siberia across part of Mongolia and into Central Asia. Gradually they filtered southward, and by the 7th century their great Khan was received almost as an equal at the court of Yang Di, last emperor of the Sui dynasty. It was this same Turkish Khan who helped the half-Turkish general Li Yuan overthrow the emperor Yang Di and establish the celebrated Tang dynasty, which for 3 centuries reigned over Eastern Asia from Chang'an, now Xianfu, then perhaps the most cultured capital on earth. Mohammedan mosques had already been built in Guangzhou by seafaring Arab traders before the middle of the 7th century. With the advent of the tolerant Tang power, the religion rapidly penetrated by land routes through the Turks of the northwest. Mullahs, traders, embassies and warriors brought it from Persia, Arabia and Turkestan, and the Tang emperors formed close ties with the caliphates to the west. Especially in the 9th century, when vast hordes of Uyghur Turks, whose great leader Seljuk had not yet been born, were summoned to the aid of the Tang court to suppress rebellion. Islam entrenched itself in China. Following their success, many of the Uyghurs were rewarded with titles and great estates and settled in the northwest and in Sichuan and Yunnan. Over a period of centuries, the Mohammedans stoutly resisted Chinese absorption, but gradually lost their Turkish culture, adopted much that was Chinese, and became more or less submissive to Chinese law. Yet in the 19th century, they were still powerful enough to make 2 great bids for power. One when Du Wei-xiu for a time set up a kingdom in Yunnan and proclaimed himself Sultan Suleiman, and the last in 1864 when Mohammedans seized control of all of the northwest and even invaded Hubei. The latter rebellion was put down after a campaign lasting 11 years. At that time of waning Manchu power, the able Chinese general Zhou Congtang astounded the world by recapturing Hubei, Shanxi, Gansu, and eastern Tibet, finally leading his victorious army across the desert roads of Turkestan, where he re-established Chinese power on that far frontier in Central Asia. Since then, no single leader had been able to unite the Muslims of China in a successful struggle for independence, but there had been sporadic uprisings against Chinese rule, with savage and bloody massacres on both sides. The most serious recent rebellion occurred in 1928, when General Feng Yuxiang was warlord of the northwest. It was under Feng that the Wu Ma, or 5 Ma, combination acquired much of its influence and secured the nucleus of its present wealth and power. Although theoretically the Chinese considered the Hui or Muslim people one of the 5 great races of China, most Chinese seemed to deny Muslim racial separateness, claiming that they had been Sinicized. In practice, the Kuomintang decidedly followed a policy of absorption, even more direct, though perhaps less successful, than that pursued toward the Mongols. The Chinese official attitude toward the Mohammedans seemed to be that they were a religious minority, but not a national minority. However, it was quite evident to anyone who saw them in their own domain in the northwest that their claims to racial unity and the right to nationhood as a people were not without substantial basis in fact and history. The Mohammedans of China were said to number about 20 million, and of these at least half were concentrated in the provinces of Shaanxi, Gansu, Ningxia, Sichuan, Qinghai, and Xinjiang. In many districts, particularly in Gansu and Qinghai, they were a majority, and in some large areas outnumbered Chinese as much as 10 to 1. Generally, their religious orthodoxy seemed to vary according to their strength and numbers in a given spot, but in the dominantly Mohammedan region of northern Gansu and southern Ningxia, the atmosphere was distinctly that of an Islamic country. It could be said that the Mohammedans were the largest community left in China, among whom religious leaders were the real arbiters of temporal as well as spiritual life, with religion a deciding factor in their culture, politics, and economy. Mohammedan society revolved around the Menhuang and the Ahun, Amir and Mullah, and their knowledge of the Quran and of Turkish or Arabic, scant as it usually was, provided the sources of authority. Mohammedans in the northwest prayed daily in the hundreds of well-kept mosques, observed Mohammedan feast days, fast days, and marriage and funeral ceremonies, rejected pork, and were offended by the presence of pigs and dogs. The pilgrimage to Mecca was an ambition frequently realized by rich men and Ahuns, who thereby strengthened their political and economic power. To many of them, pan-Islamism rather than pan-Hanism was an ideal. Chinese cultural influence was nevertheless very marked. Muslims dressed like Chinese, except for round white caps or ceremonial fezes worn by the men and white turbans by the women, and all spoke Chinese as the language of daily life, although many knew a few words from the Quran. While markedly Turkish features were common among them, the physiognomy of the majority was hardly distinguishable from that of the Chinese, with whom they had for centuries intermarried. Because of their law that any Chinese who married a Mohammedan must not only adopt the faith but also be adopted into a Mohammedan family, cutting away from his or her own kinsmen, the children of mixed marriages tended to grow up regarding themselves as a species different from their Chinese relatives. The struggle of 3 sects among the Chinese Muslims somewhat weakened their unity and created a convenient alignment for the Chinese communists to work among them. The 3 sects were simply the old, new, and modern schools. Old and new had formed a kind of united front of their own to oppose the heretical modern school. The latter nominally advocated giving up many of the ceremonies and customs of Mohammedanism and embracing science, but its real objectives were evidently to destroy the temporal power of the mullahs, which the 4 Mas found inconvenient. Since it was supported by the Kuomintang, many Mohammedans believed the modern school aimed at a so-called pan-Hanism, absorption of the national minorities by the Chinese. In the northwest, the 4 Mas were leaders of the modern school. Around them they grouped their own satellites, bureaucrats and wealthy landowners and cattle barons, upon whom their regime depended. And yet the great horses were not precisely the men one would expect to lead a reform movement in religion. Take Ma Hongui, probably the richest and strongest of the quartet. He had numerous wives, was said to own about 60% of the property of Ningxia City, and had made a fortune in millions from opium, salt, furs, taxes, and his own paper currency. Still, he proved himself modern enough, in one sense, when he chose the famous picture bride. Importing a secretary from Shanghai, he had him gather photographs of eligible, educated beauties and made his choice. The price was fixed at $50,000. Old Ma hired an aeroplane, flew out of northwestern dust clouds to Zhou, where he swooped up the latest addition to his harem, a graduate of Suzhou Christian University, and then swept back again to Ningxia like Aladdin on his carpet, amid a blaze of publicity. That news was well reported by the Kuomintang press at the time, as were some of the death and taxes data mentioned below. A government bulletin published in Ningxia listed the following taxes collected in that province by General Ma: sales, domestic animals, camels, salt carrying, salt consumption, opium lamps, sheep, merchants, porters, pigeons, land, middlemen, food, special food, additional land, wood, coal, skins, slaughter, boats, irrigation, millstones, houses, wood, milling, scales, ceremonies, tobacco, wine, stamp, marriage, and vegetables. While this did not exhaust the inventory of petty taxes collected, it was enough to suggest that people had relatively little to fear from the Reds. Ma Hongkui's method of salt distribution was unique. Salt was not only a monopoly, every person was required to buy £0.5 per month, whether he could use it or not. He was not allowed to resell it. The private trade in salt was punishable by whipping, or, according to Mohammedan Reds, even death. Other measures against which the inhabitants protested were the collection of 30% tax on the sale of a sheep, cow, or mule, a 20-cent tax on the ownership of a sheep, a $1 tax for the slaughter of a pig, and a 40-cent tax on the sale of a bushel of wheat. Excessive taxation and indebtedness had forced many farmers to sell all their cattle and abandon their lands. Great areas had been bought up by officials, tax collectors, and lenders at very cheap rates, but much of it remained wasteland because no tenants could be found to work under the tax burden and rents imposed. The concentration of land, cattle, and capital was accelerating, and there was a big increase in hired farm labourers. In one district investigated, it was found that over 70% of the farmers were in debt, and about 60% were living on food bought on credit. In the same district, 5% of the people reportedly owned from 100 to 200 mo of land, 20 to 50 camels, 20 to 40 cows, 5 to 10 horses, 5 to 10 carts, and had from $1,000 to $2,000 in trading capital, while at about the same time, about 60% of the population had less than 15 mo of land, no livestock other than 1 or 2 donkeys, and an average indebtedness of $35 and 366 pounds of grain, much more than the average value of their land. According to the communist press, Ma Hongkui was suspected of intriguing for Japanese support against the Reds. A Japanese military mission had been established in Ningxia City, and General Ma had given them permission to build an airfield north of the city, in the Alashan Mongol territory. Some of the Muslims and Mongols feared an actual armed Japanese invasion. Such was the picture as the Reds saw it, which encouraged them to believe that they could stir up a great wind that could bring the Ma brothers' empire toppling in ruins. Ma's troops might have had little interest in fighting, but it still remained for the communists to overcome the Muslims' aversion to cooperating with Chinese and to offer them a suitable program. This the Reds were trying hard to do, for the strategic significance of the Mohammedan areas was manifest. They occupied a wide belt in the northwest which dominated the roads to Xinjiang and Outer Mongolia, and direct contact with Soviet Russia. As the communists themselves saw it, there are more than 10 million Mohammedans in the northwest occupying an extremely important position. Our present mission and responsibility is to defend the northwest and create an anti-Japanese base in these 5 provinces, so that we can more powerfully lead the anti-Japanese movement of the whole country and work for an immediate war against Japan. At the same time, in the development of our situation, we can get into connection with the Soviet Union and Outer Mongolia. However, it would be impossible to carry out our mission if we failed to win over the Mohammedans to our sphere and to the anti-Japanese front. Communist work among the Mohammedans had begun several years before in the northwest. Early in 1936, when the Red Army moved across Ningxia and Gansu toward the Yellow River, vanguards of young Muslims were already propagandizing among the Ningxia troops, urging the overthrow of the Kuomintang running dog and traitor to Mohammedanism Ma Hongkui, and some had lost their heads for it. These were the main promises the Reds made to them: to abolish all surtaxes, to help form an autonomous Mohammedan government, to prohibit conscription, to cancel old debts and loans, to protect Mohammedan culture, to guarantee religious freedom of all sects, to help create and arm an anti-Japanese Mohammedan army, to help unite Mohammedans of China, Outer Mongolia, Xinjiang, and Soviet Russia. Here, presumably, was something to appeal to nearly every Muslim. Even some of the Ahuns reportedly saw it an opportunity to get rid of Ma Hongkui, punishing him for burning the mosques of the old and new schools, and also a chance to realize an old aspiration, to re-establish direct contact with Turkey through Central Asia. By May, the communists were claiming that they had achieved what skeptics had said was impossible. They boasted that they had created the nucleus of a Chinese-Muslim Red Army. 4. Muslim and Marxist. One morning I went with an English-speaking member of Xu Haidong's staff to visit the Muslim training regiment attached to the 15th Army Corps. It was quartered in the compound of a Muslim merchant and official, a thick-walled edifice with Moorish windows looking down on a cobbled street through which filed donkeys, horses, camels, and men. Inside, the place was cool and neatly kept. Every room had in the centre of its brick floor a place for a cistern, connected to a subterranean drain to be used for bathing. Properly Orthodox Muslims showered themselves 5 times daily, but although these soldiers were still loyal to their faith and obviously made use of the cistern occasionally, I gather that they did not believe in carrying a good thing to extremes. Still, they easily had the cleanest habits of any soldiers I had seen in China, and carefully refrained from the national gesture of spitting on the floor. The Reds had organised 2 training regiments of Mohammedans at the front, both recruited largely from former troops of Ma Hongui and Ma Hubing. They were taller and more strongly built than the Chinese, heavier of beard and darker skinned, with large black almond-shaped eyes and strong, sharp Caucasian features. They all carried the big sword of the northwest, and gave a skillful demonstration of various strokes by which you can remove your enemy's head at one swift blow. Cartoons, posters, maps and slogans covered the walls of their barracks. Down with Ma Hongui, abolish Ma Honghui's Kuomintang government, oppose Japan's building of airfields, map-making and invasion of Ningxia, realize the independent government of the Mohammedan people, build your own anti-Japanese Mohammedan Red Army. From this it may be gathered that there was some dissatisfaction with General Ma Hongui among his soldiers, and this seemed to be shared by the Ningxia peasants. I stopped on the road one morning to buy a melon from a Muslim farmer who had a whole hillside covered with them. He was an engaging old rustic with a jolly face, a humorous manner, and a truly beautiful daughter, so rare an apparition in those parts that I stayed and bought 3 melons. I asked him if Ma Honghui's officials were really as bad as the Reds claimed. He threw up his hands comically in indignation, sputtering watermelon seeds everywhere between his gums. "Ay-ya, ay-ya, ay-ya," he cried. "Ma Hongui, taxing us to death, stealing our sons, burning and killing. Mada Ma Hongui," by which last expression he had meant you could defile Ma's mother and it would be too good for him. Everyone in the courtyard laughed. On the other hand, the occasion was hardly appropriate for the old gentleman to offer testimony to Allah in praise of Ma Hongui if he had been so inclined. The Muslim soldiers with the Reds ostensibly had been won over by subversive propaganda conducted among Ma's troops, and by political lectures when they reached the Red camp. I asked one commander why he had joined. "To fight Ma Hongui," he said. "Life is too bitter for us Huimen under Ma Hongui. No family is secure. If a family has 2 sons, one of them must join his army. If it has 3 sons, 2 must join. There is no escape, unless you are rich and can pay the tax for a substitute. What poor man can afford it? Not only that, but every man must bring his own clothes, and his family must pay for his food, fires, and lighting. This costs several tens of dollars a year." Although these Red Muslim regiments had been organised less than half a year, they had already achieved considerable class consciousness, it seemed. They had read or heard read the Communist Manifesto, brief lessons from class struggle, and daily political lectures, à la Marxism, on the immediate problems of the Mohammedan people. This instruction was given to them, not by Chinese, but by Mohammedan members of the Communist Party, men who had been through the Reds' party school. I was told that more than 90% of Ma Honghui's troops were illiterate, and that most of the Muslim recruits to the Red Army had been unable to read at all when they joined. Now they were said to know a few hundred characters each, and to be able to study the simplest lessons given to them. Out of their 2 training regiments, the Communists hoped to develop cadres for a big Muslim Red Army to defend the autonomous Muslim Republic they dreamed of seeing established in the northwest. Already nearly 25% of these Muslims had joined the Communist Party. With the autonomy slogan, the Muslim population could be expected to agree. That had been their demand for many years. Whether the majority of them believed the Reds were sincere in their promises was quite another matter. I doubted it. Years of maltreatment by the Chinese militarists, and racial hatreds between Han and Hui, Chinese and Muslim, had left among them a deep and justified distrust of the motives of all Chinese, and it was unbelievable that the Communists had been able to break down this Muslim skepticism in so short a time. Such Muslims as cooperated with the Reds probably had reasons of their own. If Chinese offered to help them drive out the Kuomintang, help them create and equip an army of their own, help them get self-government, and help them despoil the rich, they no doubt said to themselves, they were prepared to take their opportunity, and later on to turn that army to uses of their own, if the Reds failed to keep their bargain. But it seemed from the friendliness of the farmers, and their readiness to organise under the Reds, that their programme had some attraction, and that their careful policy of respecting Muslim institutions had made an impression. Among the soldiers themselves, it appeared that some of the historic racial animosity was being overcome, or gradually metamorphosed into class antagonism. Thus, when I spoke to some Muslim soldiers whether they thought the Hui and Han peoples could cooperate under a Soviet government, one replied, "The Chinese and Muslims are brothers. We Muslims also have Chinese blood in us. We all belong to Da Zhongguo, China. And therefore, why should we fight each other? Our common enemies are the landlords, the capitalists, the moneylenders, our oppressive rulers, and the Japanese. Our common aim is revolution. But what if the revolution interferes with your religion? There is no interference. The Red Army does not interfere with Mohammedan worship. Well, I mean something like this. Some of the Ahuns are wealthy landlords and moneylenders, are they not? What if they oppose the Red Army? How would you treat them? We would persuade them to join the revolution, but most Ahuns are not rich men. They sympathize with us. One of our company commanders was an Ahun. Still, suppose some Ahuns can't be persuaded, but join with the Kuomintang to oppose you. We would punish them. They would be bad Ahuns, and the people would demand their punishment. Meanwhile, intensive instruction was going on throughout the 1st and 15th Army Corps to educate the soldiers to an understanding of the communist policy towards Muslims and their effort to create a Hui-Han united front. I attended several political sessions in which soldiers were discussing the Mohammedan revolution, and they were quite interesting. At one session there were long debates, especially about the land question. Some argued that the Red Army should confiscate the land of great Mohammedan landlords. Others opposed it. The political commissar then gave a concise statement of the party's position, explaining why it was necessary for the Mohammedans themselves to carry on their own land revolution, led by a strong revolutionary organization of their own, with a base in the Muslim masses. Another company reviewed a brief history of relationships between the Muslims and Chinese, and another discussed the necessity for strict observance of the rules of conduct which had been issued to all soldiers stationed in Mohammedan districts. These latter decreed that red soldiers must not enter the home of a Muslim without his consent, molest a mosque or a priest in any way, say pig or dog before Muslims, or ask them why they don't eat pork, or call the Muslims small faith and the Chinese big faith. Besides these efforts to unite the whole army intelligently behind the Muslim policy of the Reds, there was incessant work with the peasantry. The 2 Muslim training regiments led in this propaganda, but companies in the Red Army also sent their propaganda corps from house to house, explaining communist policies and urging the farmers to organize. Army dramatic clubs toured the villages, giving Mohammedan plays based on local situations and incidents of history, and designed to agitate the population. Leaflets, newspapers, and posters were distributed, written in Chinese and Arabic, and mass meetings were frequently called to form revolutionary committees and village soviets. The peasant, Chinese or Muslim, had a hard squeeze of it to avoid indoctrination to at least some degree. By July, several dozen Mohammedan communities in Ningxia had elected village soviets and were sending delegates to Yuwang to confer with Muslim communists there. 4 months later, the 4th Front Red Army was to cross the Yellow River, move over 200 miles further west, and reach Zhou in Ma Bufeng's territory, aside the main road to Xinjiang. Early in September, enough progress had been made in Ningxia to convene a meeting of over 300 Muslim delegates from the Soviet committees elected by the villages then under the Red Army. A number of Ahuns, teachers, merchants, and 2 or 3 small landlords were among them, but mostly they were poor farmers, members of the wealthier classes having fled with the arrival of the Han bandits. The meeting of delegates elected a chairman and a provisional Muslim Soviet government committee. They passed resolutions to cooperate with the Red Army and accept its offer to help create an anti-Japanese Mohammedan army, and to begin at once the organization of a Chinese Muslim Unity League, a Poor People's League, and a mass anti-Japanese society. The last item of business attended to by this historic little convention, and I suspect the most important to the peasants there, was the disposal of a Kuomintang tax collector. This man had evidently earned himself considerable enmity before the Reds arrived, and after that he had fled into the neighbouring hill villages, to a place called Zhangjia Cha, and there continued to collect his taxes. It was alleged that he had doubled his levies, and had announced that this was due to the regulations of the new Red government which he claimed to represent, but the Mohammedan farmers learned that the Reds appointed no tax collectors, and half a dozen of them captured this miscreant and brought him into Yuwang for a mass trial. My personal reaction to the story was that any man who had sufficient nerve to act as an impostor in such a role at such a time had talents that should be preserved. The Muslims thought otherwise. There was no dissenting vote when the delegates took the decision to execute him. As far as I could learn, he was the only civilian shot during the 2 weeks I spent in Yuwang.